Today we have, after having had an advertising executive, 3 outstanding engineers, today we are on to a truly important topic, beer. Our guests this morning are the brewers Dan and Martha Paquette of Pretty Things Beer and Ale Project. Dan Paquette is a brewing industry veteran in the middle of a busy career with over 20 years experience working in over 10 breweries on 2 continents. He began his career in the early 90s, and in 2008 he started Pretty Things Beer and Ale Project, finding a way to do it for short money by renting space from local breweries. Pretty Things has put a stamp on the Boston brewing scene and has allowed Dan to do the creative things he's been dreaming of for 20 years. Martha Paquette is British and grew up in Yorkshire in the north of England. She has a BA and a PhD in virology from the University of Cambridge in the UK. She moved to Boston to work as a research assistant at Harvard Medical School, and then she met Dan, and that was the end of that. Today, Martha is Dan's assistant brewer. She attended UC Davis for a short course in brewing science in 2012. In the brewery, she runs parts of each brew and spends the rest of her time managing inventory, packaging, scheduling, and logistics. Please join me in welcoming Dan and Martha Paquette.
Hi everyone, thanks for coming. So we're going to talk to you about our design, mostly of our packaging. But feel free, if you have questions about other parts of our business, we're very open to them. So when we get to the discussion section, I don't know if you can wave your hands, but if you want to, feel free to. So I'm going to start off by telling you a little bit about just our company and when we started and how we started, so that you can get a feel for where our design comes from. I think it's important, I don't know how many of you currently drink beer or craft beer or know very much about craft beer, but there's very different types of businesses within the craft beer world, and we are definitely at the small end, the artisanal end is what we would say. So we started our brewery or our business in 2008 for $8,000, which isn't very much money to start a business with. It was the last of our life savings. And you really can't build a brewery for $8,000, as I'm sure you realize. So what we did was we rented another person's brewery and we brewed our own beer in their facility. And that pretty much used up the whole $8,000. But the nice thing about our business is that we don't have any debt because of that. So we didn't take out $1 million loan and build a big, shiny new brewery. And that really informs our design ethic, I think, our feel. Because if you have $1 million bank loan, you have to worry about what your banker thinks of your packaging. You have to go and justify it to him or her. Whereas we don't have to justify our design to anybody other than ourselves. And so you'll see, I think that gives us like a different feel. And we're a 3-person company, so enormous corporation. We started it with Dan's 15 years of brewing experience, very much hands-on. He'd never really designed packaging before. He'd never run a business before. And I had a PhD in virology, which, as you would imagine, is not useful at all in brewing. So we brewed our first beer the day that President Bush announced the $8 billion bank bailout. Do you remember that day? It was kind of a crazy day. We were sort of bailing out all these massive companies, and here we were in a borrowed car driving out to Holyoke, Massachusetts with the last of our life savings, starting a business. It didn't seem like a very good idea at the time, but as it turned out, it turned out to be quite a good idea. So we grew from 200 barrels. So a barrel in beer is 2 kegs. So if you can imagine a keg, which hopefully most of you can, a barrel is 2 of those. So we started brewing about 200 a year, and we've grown to about 3,500. Most of the growth happened in years 2 and 3. So we had a crazy growth story. We started off tiny, and then everything just went crazy, and we grew very fast, and we had to figure out how to make that happen. Now things have slowed down a lot. And that's something that I think is relevant to our design and the label story that I'm going to tell you today. It's really been informed by the competition that's sprung up and the craft beer market and the craft brewing movement. So hopefully that will become obvious. So we brew in this bottle format. You want to be the stunt guy, the prop guy?
Stunt.
Maybe not the stunts guy. I don't know what you could do with it. So this is our bottle size. It's kind of a bigger bottle size. And that's been part of why we're smaller, because your average beer bottle, as I'm sure you know, is like your 6-pack bottle. It's half that size. So we're sort of a smaller niche market. And our label designs have really been informed by the way our business and the way the craft brewing environment has changed during the last 5 years. I think it's important to say that we're very happy at our current size. We want to be small because we're all about the brewing. We're not really about the marketing and the other stuff. So it's important to know that we feel successful even though we're slowing down. All right, you want to talk about the brewery and the different things up here?
Yeah, so here's just a few slides to give you an idea of the scale that we brew at. As Martha said, we don't have our own brewery, which has never stopped me from making good beer at breweries in my entire career. So it's really no different than for me having a head brewing job, except for we run our own business. This brewery is down in Westport, Mass. It's called Buzzards Bay. We can make in a day, or we can brew in a day, the equivalent of about 200 kegs worth of beer. Now, we usually go 50% bottle versus keg. So it's quite a lot of, it's 3,100 gallons we can get in a fermenter in a day. That's a 13-hour day with Martha and I doing all the labor. We make about 80 or 90% of the beer coming out of this brewery, which shows you that the relationship we have with the actual owners of the brewery is a good one, because not many breweries would allow this sort of thing to happen. But we came on board at a good time for them when things were really down, and we, through brewing lots of beer there, have essentially invested in that brewery. But we don't own any of it, and they don't own any of ours. So it gives you a little idea of the setting. It's a 260-acre farm, so, with all the water coming from a deep 300-foot well, very hard water. And it's quite a beautiful place. We only really see the inside of it. We can't tell you too much about Westport, Massachusetts, other than we're inside those four walls. And we travel down. We're based out of Somerville, so we travel down there a couple times a week to do the brewing. And our beers typically take about 3 weeks if they're ales, lagers up to 7 weeks to make.
Cool, and I'll just point out, for those of you who don't really know what beer is, so the grains that you can see, that's barley, that's malted barley. And basically the process of brewing is to take grain and turn it into a sort of sweet liquid, which you then ferment with yeast to end up with an alcoholic beer, right? And the picture on the far right of something that looks a bit like a rocket ship, that's a fermenter. So that gives you a feel for, they're quite big, they're like 30 feet up. All right, so this is the outline for what we're gonna present to you today. Really, designing our business has fallen into 3 phases. So when we first started, we were very hand-drawn. We designed the first beer label ourselves, sitting at the kitchen table. We hand-labeled every bottle, so we're talking very small, very artisanal, and we had neck labels on our bottles that we printed on our own laser printer. They were actually VHS spine labels. Do you remember VHS tapes? Probably don't, that's shocking. But anyway, the spine labels off VHS tapes we used. Crazy.
You'll see a picture of that later.
Yeah, you'll see a picture of it in just a second. The second phase, I think, was the growth phase. So remember I said, like in years 2 and 3, we really started to grow. And so did the market in general, the craft beer market. So we wanted new labels. We wanted it to look a little bit more professional and glamorous. So we realized we could do die cuts, and we did slightly more intricate designs. And we also weren't able to apply those hand-applied labels anymore because we were making too much beer, so we had to switch. So we used a custom cap instead, which we're still using today. And then really our recent designs, which is the one you can see on the table and I'll talk about in a bit, that's really our most recent response to the new market, the local market, which is a very competitive market now. When we first started, we were the only guys doing this. Now we are one of many, and we really need to stand out on the shelves. So hopefully, you'll see as I show you the different designs that we've gone from something crazy small and artisanal and fun looking, but like so niche it's not even true, to something that you can maybe walk into a shop and you'll instantly recognize it from across the shop. All right. So the drivers for our designs, I've already mentioned them really, but early on, they were sort of financial constraints. We were very inspired by European brewing. Dann brewed in Yorkshire, and we've always loved going to Belgium and drinking beer, and vintage beer art. And then recent drivers are a bit more sort of businessy. They're financial, practical considerations, labeling technologies, the competition that's out there in the market, and we still love vintage advertising art. All right, so one note about beer, just so you understand the product that you're dealing with. It's not a building, it's not anything substantial. Beer is, by its very nature, ephemeral. You drink it and then it's gone. It's never going to exist again. So really the goal of the entire craft brewing industry, in my mind, it could be summed up as trying to make consumers think about beer more and make beer less ephemeral. So if you think about like Budweiser, you really don't think too much about the liquid. You just knock that back at a party and you move on. You don't think about it very much. And craft beers are not like that. Craft beers have a lot more going on. They have a lot more flavor, a lot more color. They have all these crazy stories associated with them. And we're trying to get you to care about that liquid. We're trying to get you to interact with that liquid and make it part of your life in a way that I think sort of mass-marketed breweries don't really mind so much about. All right, so we really, we didn't think this through when we were designing our first beer label. We had no design background. We weren't thinking in those terms. But what we did want to make was a beer for our own table, a beer that you would drink, any family could drink with their dinner and enjoy it. A beer that meant fun. It meant that work was over and you could go and have fun with your friends. And a beer to go back to. So the craft brewing industry is very crowded. It would be very easy for you to drink a different beer every day of the whole year and never go back to it. You wouldn't even have to think about it. You could just grab a different bottle. We want you to go back to our beer. And so it has to be an enduring beer, a beer that isn't so ephemeral, that doesn't disappear. So that's Jack Dore, and he's like our guy. He's the one who pays the bills. We also make a bunch of other beers, and some of those are very quirky and one-off. So we don't really mind so much about making them enduring in that situation. They can be very quirky looking, can't they? And just sort of a little bit more ephemeral. We're going to talk about our labels today. We're not really going to touch on too much else, but just so you know that obviously there's more to it than that. We have different selling environments, basically bars and restaurants, and then stores, liquor stores. So in the bar and the restaurant, it's all about the tap handle, and that's our tap handle. We don't have any variety in that. That's just what we use. It's pretty striking, and I think it does the job well. And then we make glassware. We make all this other stuff. Do you want to talk about this, since you drew it?
Okay, yeah. So the original Jack Dore, when we started this, I had no background in drawing or illustration or anything. I probably hadn't drawn in 20 years. And we tried hiring an artist, but we didn't have enough money. And every time I described Jack Dore to them, it kind of looked like those M&M guys that you see in the commercials. He never came out right. So I think I spent a whole week drawing this Jack Dore. Drew every sort of little thing in, as you can see, on a piece of paper. Then we scanned them in and put it together. I think if anyone knows Photoshop, it was a 260-layer document, which is apparently horrifying number of layers. But you know, we were really driven by quirky, small European breweries where you know, sort of uncommercial enterprises. And Jack Dore, by the way, he's a grain of barley. You can't really tell because not many people know what barley looks like. A lot of people think he's an egg or a lemon or a bean. We've heard just about everything. A lamb, which was disturbing. But, he's a barley, and he's kind of, that's what you're looking at is the brewing process. He's sort of trying to turn himself into beer. And that's it. And you know, when we started this company, this was pretty much, we thought this was going to be our only label. We thought we'd probably make 1 or 2 batches, then I would get a job at another brewery, and everything would be over. And you know, this was the sort of, you know, weird label that would remind people that we existed. Oh yeah, I remember that weird label that you guys made, you know, on a resume sort of thing. But, you know, so that's sort of where we started off. We were just trying to please ourselves and do one beer.
This is a good example of the things we were inspired by. This is a brewery from Belgium, and I think this is worth showing you because it's just such a cool design idea. Every bottle has a bow tie. It's wearing a bow tie. And this is a brewery where the brewer actually draws his own labels, which is very unusual. I think this is the only other brewery that I know of.
It was like we're the two in the world. We're them and us.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And this is an example of the beer labels that were prevalent when we first started our business. So as you can see, there was lots of browns, lots of like Microsoft Word fonts, papyrus. So I think it was very easy for us to be different, I think is the point I'm trying to make. Came in, we were colourful, we were different, we were very handmade, and we stood out like a sore thumb, which was good for us. This was the first 5 beers that we brewed, so you can see those neck labels, you can see that they were obviously very colourful, and we really stuck to the hand-drawn vibe through necessity. But by this time, we were also having fun with it, and people were starting to tell us that they liked this, which was interesting to us. It was unexpected. So we sort of went with it, didn't we? Mm-hmm. So why did it work? I think it worked because it's very honest. There's no, we're not trying to take you somewhere that we're not. So it looked local, and obviously we were local. It looked very handmade, and it certainly was handmade, and we hand-labeled it. You know, it was very small. And it looked artistic, it looked complicated and interesting. It looked like if you spent $6 on this bottle that you'd never seen before, it might be kind of cool. Like, it might be $6 well spent, because there's obviously a story here. There's obviously more to it than just another beer brand. I think in the financial environment that we launched in, it was the Great Recession. As I said, it was like the bailout time, and everyone was depressed about big businesses. I think it was a great time to be a tiny, small, local startup. People wanted us to succeed. That was huge. And the word artisanal was still meaningful. Nowadays, Dunkin' Donuts describes their bagels as artisanal. But back when we started, it really meant handmade. It means craft, right? It's just French word for craft. And this is a craft beer, and I think that people still connected with that in a very meaningful way. So that was our original package. This is phase 2. Do you remember when I said we grew fast and we wanted to look a little bit more professional? This is what we ended up doing. This is a picture of Dan at a beer tasting in a liquor store. And as you can see, the shield just went out of control crazy.
What on earth?
So we had coasters, we had signs, we had T-shirts, and the label became shield-shaped as well. We did like a die-cut label. But, you know, it was fun, and I think it was very busy. I think we got a bit carried away. The reason we did this really was due to local competition, which really started to spring up in our 2nd and 3rd years of business. And competitors really took the colorful thing that we were doing and ran with it. So what we describe as the beer wall, which is the wall of beer that you see in a liquor store when you walk into it, it was just becoming just crazy, out of control, colorful. It was very hard to find anything in there. So we thought this die shape for the shield and carrying our shield logo down onto the label. And then we did the custom cap, which is very strong, like our shield as well. Just to give you a few examples of the local and national beer labels that started to spring up after we'd been going a couple of years. You can see that they're all very colorful, and quite a lot of them are very hand-drawn looking as well. So we realized that we were no longer the only brand out there doing this. We realized that we were getting lost in the crowd. And this is a few beer walls, what we describe as the beer wall in different liquor stores to show you. And it's very typical. You can just see in that one on the right where I'm doing a tasting, you can just see how brands just get piled on top of each other on the walls. Like there's a Sam Adams covered up by another one, covered up by another one. It's just crazy out there. So trying to stand out in this environment, just imagine walking into a shop, you want your brand to be evident and different looking and still cool looking. It's quite challenging. So this was really the trigger for our most recent label redesign. So this is our most recent redesign. The design inspiration for this was really old advertising posters, which they're in the MFA. We go to the MFA all the time to get sort of inspiration, and we loved the Campari posters, didn't we? And we were very I remember we stood there and for some reason we had a big argument in front of this Campari poster. I can't remember what we were arguing about, but it shows you that we were very fired up by it. And so we sort of took those bold colors and simplified fonts, and we took them back. You want to talk?
No, not right now.
So he's used to that. So we wanted to look like a more established brand. So when we started, we wanted to look quirky. We were quirky, and then just carrying the honesty through. Like we want to look like who we are. We want to be a classic Boston brand. We want people to really recognize us as Boston's saison in this case. And we still needed to stand out more, and the color is not going away. So we wanted to simplify a little bit so that even though we're still colorful, we're maybe even a little bit easier to spot. So that's what we came up with. this sort of shows you the two labels side by side, the first one and then the most recent one with our crazy shield design in the middle. So when you look at us on the shelf now, I think we have something which we didn't really have before, which is a sort of uniformity. You can maybe tell that all these beers are brewed by the same people, which is good. And you can also read the names of the beers, which we realized you couldn't on the old labels. So that's a plus, I think. And it's interesting because our design has never been informed by more than just us being out there all the time, every day, and trying to achieve a business goal, really. But we've noticed that once again, we're sort of in keeping with things that are happening in the industry at large. So this shows you our new labels, and then if you look at these two brands, so the top brand is New Belgium Brewing. I don't know if you guys have heard of them. They're based in Colorado. They're a very, very big craft brewery. And their old label design is on the left, and as you can see, it was sort of hand-drawn, watercolored, quite detailed. And then on the right is their new label. And it's funny because we have friends who work at New Belgium, and when we were just finishing up the Jackdaw design, we went to stay with them, and we showed it to them, and they were like, "Oh, did you see our new labels?" And they're like exactly the same kind of redesign, but we promised we did it before them. We didn't steal it from them. And then the bottom one is Mendocino.
This just happened. We just got this today.
This morning.
Brand new redesign.
So once again, we're going to disappear into a sea, I guess, this time of simpler labels with bold fonts. So who knows what we'll do next. But it's interesting how that like mass intellect, it all happens at the same time. And then really, just as the last slide, this is our merchandising. So this is not beer labels anymore. This is like hats and hoodies and T-shirts and stuff. And it never really occurred to me, but it's very different from our labels. Like, it's very not colorful. We stick to very simple colors, and the fonts have always been quite bold. So I don't know how this ties in with the rest of our brand. Maybe it doesn't. But hey, it's kind of fun. All right, so I'll finish on this slide, which is a busy slide, just to show you the range of stuff that we get up to in terms of glassware, stupid ideas that we've had. We were going to make a Jackdaw plush, a soft toy thing. That never happened. Temporary tattoos, stained glass windows. Like, our branding has just kind of exploded from the original sort of little idea that we had in a nutshell. It's sort of interesting to see what happened. We hadn't been through this exercise before because we're not design people, and we'd never sat down and applied thought to our business design before. So it's been interesting to put this together.
Yeah, and I should say too, like, I've been in this business for 20 years, and I never worked for a successful brewery. So there's a lot of struggle to lead up to this point in terms of the industry. And now we're at a place where people actually like the beers that we're making. I spent probably a decade handing my beer to people and having them spit it out. So, this exuberance you see up here is a good example of like, we're just thrilled that we can make a go of it finally.
There you go. So on that note, we'll stop talking, but thank you.
Well, this is fantastic. Thank you very much for that. And I have to say, I didn't know what you were going to focus on. And I'm very glad that you did focus a lot on how you visually communicate who you are, because it seems that there are dozens and hundreds of breweries.
Thousands.
Thousands.
3,000, I think, in the U.S. now. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, in my office before we came over here, we were talking about how, how dramatically different this landscape is from, let's say, when I was growing up, when it was a regional beer was something like Old Style, which was actually bigger than Budweiser in Chicago, but it was, and then there were kind of big regional beers, but for the most part, the idea that there were a wide range of kinds of beer was really very not the case. Maybe a specialty bar here or there, but so anyway, this whole culture of not just beer, but wine and bread and many other things that used to be industrial products of post-war industrial manufacturing became available in a much more handmade kind of context. And I wonder if before we kind of get into more of the details, if you guys want to talk a little bit about what you take to be, because when we talk about empathy, when we talk about understanding why people want these things, I think it maybe makes sense to start with why this explosion? What are people looking for?
Well, you know, in a lot of what we do in beer, I say we're kind of in show business because when you drink beer, you know, 1,000 years ago you were drinking beer for survival because water carried disease, and now we drink beer for entertainment purposes mainly. Right. So I think it's very cheap, very quick, very easy to get bit of entertainment. It's like buying a CD or renting a movie. So I think that's where we're at now. You don't watch the same movie over and over again. You might listen to some of the same songs over and over again, but with beer, you can bounce all over the place. And so a lot of people who are really getting into beer are not getting into beer to drink one beer. They're getting into beer to drink all beer, you know, everything that's out there. And so that's sort of where we are right now, which is why breweries small and large can survive now.
Right, right.
I think more generally, though, people want to know where things come from now. And I think that's been going on for years and years, but that's part of what we've benefited from. You know, there's farm to table, we call it locavores. I remember when we first started our business, we went in to meet with our distributors. That's like a big company who aren't anything to do with artisanal beers at all. And we used the word locavore, they'd never heard it before. But now it's like part of people's vocabulary. I think people want to know where the grain comes from that went into their bread, and who made their beer, and who raised the cow that they're going to eat. So I think that's huge.
I agree. I think, though, there's an interesting shift, and you guys alluded to it in your presentation, between when, you know, certainly at the beginning of this revolution, and the revolution I'm talking about is the one that maybe started in the 80s or 70s, about the emergence of all these much more craft-oriented things. It was actually entirely about taste and quality, and ingredients maybe. It wasn't necessarily, I don't think, yet about the local issue as prominently as it is today. It was more about authenticity in the age of machine-made products, and you know, things denuded of every nuance of flavor in the interest of capacity for storage and transportation over long distances and so forth. So the first thing we get is, you know, bread that isn't Wonder Bread. Then we get coffee that isn't Maxwell House. Then we, you know, and so forth. And that goes on for a while. But then it seems, maybe around the time you guys started to get into this, that there's a whole nother quantum change, which is towards what I'm going to speculate. I want you guys to tell me if you think I'm on the right track here. It has actually more to do at that point with identity than it has to do, like all the beers, when I go to the place I know around here that has the most is called the Sunshine Tap in
Sunset Grill.
Sunset Grill, anyway. You see what it's done to me. I can't remember anything. But, you know, they have hundreds. So you could not possibly even remember all the ones they have. So, and I'm sure some are good and some are bad, but most of them are distinct from Budweiser or distinct from Coors or something like that. So they sort of clear the first hurdle, which is, oh, good, this isn't exactly the same generic thing that you can get anywhere. And then the question is, you know, this is really a way of getting at what would strike me as the most challenging proposition in your enterprise, which is distinctiveness. In that wall of beer, you're clearly interested in it because your design work is by the way, is way better. I mean, in other words, I mean, both are great, but I appreciate why at a larger scale you need to get clarity on the critical ideas that you're communicating. The first time you were selling beer, you were probably practically having conversations with most of the people who bought it. So
there was 1 degree away from us was all of our consumers at that stage.
So if the label wasn't particularly legible, that was
they still
fine. They knew everything they needed to know.
That's it. They met us. They shook our hands.
Yeah. Well, but now I think this is really interesting. In other words, what is you know, in a way, we were talking prior to this briefly about gentrification. The changing landscape of the beer world or the artisanal food world in general. I wonder what people are really going to be wanting out of this moving forward. First, it was, let's face it, the bread or the beer today is so much better than when I was a kid. It's not even in the same ballpark. And so that hurdle's been cleared. Now this is where this first question of like empathy, understanding what these people are actually looking for, not necessarily what they're telling you they're looking for.
Yeah.
And what the nature of the problem is so interesting for me in this context.
That's it. If you just think, which I think a lot of consumers do, craft beer is good beer, if you take that as a given and you're happy to basically choose anything from the craft segment, then what makes you choose this?
Well, we've found our ground, and we're standing our ground on some very basic ideals. One is we don't use novelty ingredients, so you won't find peppermint or coffee or these sort of things in the beer. The other is constant improvement. One of the things that I think was a very naive part of this business is when breweries opened in the mid-'80s and '90s, they used to always harp on about consistency. You have to make a consistent product. But who on earth wants a consistent, mediocre product? That is just, you're just going to be consistent to the point where nobody's going to even pay attention to you anymore. So we've sort of formulated this new idea of consistency, which is if we're going to change it, but it's going to get better all the time. And you got to trust us. But meanwhile, you've got 2,999 other breweries to drink from. But we want to be a beer that, when you go back to Jack Door after drinking 30 beers that are all over the map, you're going to get something that is absolutely spot on, in terms of quality. And we should say we're on batch 78 of Jack Door, and batch 76 we locked in the recipe. So it took 5 years of brewing, and I'm not an incompetent brewer. I've brewed around the world. I had something in mind, and we finally got to the place, and we might have to change it. Our raw materials might change, might have a bad hop year. I mean, we're really dependent on these weird crops that, if there's too much rain, or with hops, even worse, if there's a windstorm, they can blow away. And that's happened in 2006. There was a hop shortage because hops just blew away. I can just picture all these farmers running after them with bags and things.
These little nubbins.
Yeah.
But I think what you're saying, what it comes back to is that we're still looking for that personal connection. And that's why I think it's really important to say, like, our business isn't trying to get too big. Because I think everything that we're saying is still very niche. Like, we want people to know that we brewed it, and we want people to know that we're trying to make it better. And that's the story, that's the hook. But in order to do that, you have to be small. You can't be New Belgium and say that. Sorry. I just want to say, we're a very rare company in that there's no other brewery probably in the United States where you can say that is the person who makes the beer. There's always a brewer that is in the photographs, but he's at a desk or she's at a desk doing the ordering, and then they have a younger 25-year-old brewer who's doing all the hard work. In our situation, you can actually name the people who are brewing every drop, which is so rare.
Well, that's in itself starting to get to back into an answer to the question. What is it that the people that you are imagining people are looking for in this product? And forgive me, I know that it's an art. I know that it is something that is very close to your heart. I'm going to try to denude it of those qualities so as to shine the light bulb of analysis on what you're doing.
That's great.
That's kind of, that's what we do here. And I think that a question in this vein is when you say, for example, we nailed it at the 75th brewing, or 77th, and you say, it implies a kind of prototyping and testing. Like, here's our first batch. We're not sure if it's going to be perfect, but now against what measures, or are they so ephemeral that it's impossible for you to articulate them, but like against what measures are you going to, let's say, advertise the excellence and distinctiveness of your beer?
That is the problem with beer is the vocabulary that I speak in and the industry speaks in, and the vocabulary of the flavors. I can't talk about isoamyl acetate and acetaldehyde. You can't. So you could list the chemical components of a beer and have somebody go through and check them off and see if they like them. But you can't. So everyone says their beer is good.
Well, so I would think now, just so that this can double as both a question and answer session and a branding and positioning analysis. It seems there are businesses who are in a similar position where you can't quantify explicitly. Actually, even cars, they say car and driver's 10 best. Do you know what I mean? That's, take our word for it, because it's actually too complicated. I could tell you all about the BMW 3 Series and how it works, but you know what? We don't have enough time. Yeah. But of course, cars they sell based on a completely different set of criteria, actually. We talked about it in the first lecture in this class about, obviously that different cars have different basic meanings, and therefore, if you feel the need to convey that meaning, you purchase that kind of car. Somebody who's buying a Ford F-150 pickup truck is not the same person who's buying the Prius pretty much 99% of the time.
Right.
And it's not about necessarily did the Prius get better or did the Ford get better. They're a different thing. They're solving a different problem.
Yeah.
So, what are ways? I'm sorry, I'm going to press on this because I think in the cyclical process of design thinking, it seems like you do have to test. And you're making an assertion to begin with.
Yeah.
You're just not making them all out loud. The assertion is that the consumer wants these kinds of qualities. They want it to be genuinely artisanal. The sense of genuine, authentic stuff came up a lot to me in your presentation.
Yeah.
In an age when Dunkin' Donuts has artisanal donuts, what does that mean?
Yeah.
It means we're taught to find a word to express what we're actually doing. I mean, authenticity itself as a word has gone through exactly the same thing, hasn't it?
Yeah.
People say authentic this, authentic that, but it's not authentic. So then what do? You have to come up with a new vocabulary to explain what you're trying to get at.
Well, maybe you also have to ask, what is it, when people say that that's what they want, is that actually what's missing in their lives? In other words, if you are trying to provide, if we are trying to design things that meet needs in people's lives, oftentimes, we had a business strategy professor from this university as my guest last semester, Mark Meyer. He's just brilliant. He talked about the difference between latent desires and explicit desires. That, when I would say I want convenience, and really, this was about a baking product.
Yeah.
Really, I just want to feel like I'm baking something the way I did when I was a kid.
Yeah.
It wasn't actually about the expressed performance criteria at all. All the purchasing decisions were made based on this other thing. Now, you've already said you don't care if you get any bigger, so that's kind of taking a little air out of my question.
It does a little. It does a little.
But then how do you define success in your enterprise?
We're all about the quality. We want to grow in terms of quality and creativity, and we're sort of satisfying ourselves. It's a very selfish business in that sense. We have creative urges, and we want to satisfy them. To me, one of the reasons that people buy this beer is that they feel it enriches their lives. And I think that there's lots of different reasons for that. They might just think it's the best beer out there, but I think there's a lot of the local stuff. There's a lot of knowing us. There's a lot of understanding our story and just relating to our story. I think it's not quite just as simple as a treat, is it? But it's something meaningful that they grab, whereas they see the bigger brands as not meaningful.
Right.
So it's fuzzy, sure,
Right.
but I think it's a big driver for why people pick it up off the shelf.
Yeah.
Do you agree? No.
Yeah. He's doing my head in with these questions because there's a lot of assumptions that we make, but there's no way to really express it in a defined manner. I mean, at the end of the day, this is like a 45 single that we put out.
Right.
We don't know why people like it.
Right.
But we can give a good example. So the brewery Omegang, we were at a brewing conference. We spoke after the CEO of Omegang. They're a much bigger brewery, and he had thought about this, and he said, our beers are the BMWs. So there you go. So people are thinking about it in those terms.
Well, I'm sure they are, because most businesses are actually in the business, even no matter how, again, analogous to the gentrification conversation previously, no matter how authentically begun, there's a kind of life cycle to most businesses, not maybe all.
Right.
And even if it isn't about expressing success in terms of ever-growing number of barrels,
Right.
which I can understand,
Right.
but then maybe it's it's about quality or uniqueness and finding a way to measure that, because without being able to measure it, I guess you can just measure it by word of mouth, and if your audience is small enough, maybe you can just ask, are we still doing for you what we've always done, or are we even doing it better?
Yeah.
And by the way, could you tell me what that is?
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
No, exactly.
Well,
there you go.
kind of part of our business is the fact that people are always getting into craft beer. So, someone who's 23 years old right now might not be drinking craft beer yet. And maybe when they're 25 they will, or whatever. If they're 18 now they can't, or 21 they will. Or if some of the people are getting into it. So there always is a new wave of people coming, no matter what. Right now,
Right.
in the lifespan of this business, some of them are new to beer, some of them are new to drinking.
Right.
So we're fed off of that in a way, and return drinkers, and people who love craft beer. So it's a big audience, and we're a small company.
Right.
And so we're always going to be fulfilled in terms of our sales goals, which will allow us to have the beer goals that we have, and the fun goals that we have, because we do go out and drink beer as well. We're not just talking about beer and brewing beer. So.
Right. Well, as I was preparing for today, I thought about other, and so this is not as much in reflecting on the presentation that you gave, but rather on the sort of enterprise of selling something that, and don't take this the wrong way, but I mean, it is at some level a commodity. Beer is a thing that there are a lot of different versions of. They're more meaningfully different perhaps than some other commodities, certainly more meaningfully different than barrels of oil or something like that. But I thought about how specifically many brands identify who you get to be through the fantasy of their beer. If you drink Heineken, you get to be somebody who's kind of like James Bond, if you've watched their ads lately. or if you drink Dos Equis, you get to be the most interesting man in the world. So, like, am I pressing too hard on the kind of identity of the consumer issue here? Is this something that you think about?
That's a worrying idea when you think of our packaging and our whole thing. It's not sure I want people to be like that.
It's a scary world that we live in.
Right.
Yeah, it's a good point though. People do identify with different breweries within the craft beer market, right? There's a lot of loyalty, brand loyalty, and it's because there's outdoorsy brands like, is it Long Trail? It's like an outdoorsy brand. People who don't go hiking but maybe went hiking once in Vermont and loved it, they buy that beer because they're like, I'm a hiker.
And well, now we're getting into aspirational things, which I think are interesting.
I mean, we want people to have fun, and so we don't outwardly take ourselves too seriously with our packaging. And we spent a lot of time early on making sure that our packaging wouldn't appeal to people who weren't into good beer. I mean, we named ourselves Pretty Things as a joke, but in a lot of ways to turn away people who are going to be freaked out by our beer, because it's probably the worst beer name that's ever existed ever. I spent so many years, working for breweries where the idea was we had to bring over Budweiser drinkers to drink our beer. That's why I saw so many people spitting out our beers and, really taking lots of pity on us and things like that. With Pretty Things, we never spent a second pouring our beer or associating with anyone who even questioned whether this was fun or not, or a good idea. So, like, in that way, it's been brilliant because it's allowed us to connect with it's more us finding those people than those people finding us.
Right. Well, that's great. Let me approach some of these issues another way. What of the craft beers that you know of, and I know you guys know a lot of them, which ones do you think have have married both beer quality and a kind of identity that you think are successful? Like, see, for example, if we were to talk about automobiles or portable phones or something like that, everybody would know what the landscape was. I don't think everybody knows what this landscape is. And you've had an extensive experience in brewing. What do you think are some of the ones, even some of the, let's say, because there's a pretty big range of
let's say, craft type beers that are that have become quite successful. We spoke earlier, Harpoon, which is, at least to my generation, is still a kind of, I realize it's a very successful company. It's been there for a while, but it's still it's not
Small.
Budweiser or
Yeah,
Schlitz or those things that were there for 100 years.
Yeah.
I mean, New Belgium is a good example of
Okay, that's a good one. Yeah.
a company that has a real identity. They really have they're in Colorado, so and their main beer, one of the biggest flagship brands in the whole country is Fat Tire.
Yeah.
And
Is that
so
also in Colorado?
That's them. That's New
That's
Belgium.
them.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Fort
that's
Collins.
good.
And so they've really put this sort of outdoorsy, you're on
And
an
green
adventure,
as well.
green.
Yeah. So and that is a new personality type. People want to be green and they love being outdoors. So they really connect with that. And the other obvious one, which absolutely states it on every label, is Dogfish Head. They say off-centered beers for off-centered people. So if you consider yourself at all eccentric, you're going to gravitate towards that brand and identify with it. And they've been wildly successful.
Yeah.
So yeah, you can be very strong about it.
And
you can,
Stone with Arrogant Bastard, I guess.
Stone,
So real,
you are not worthy.
you're not worthy.
Yeah.
And so there
We're
are some
kind
of
of
that.
the opposite of
Yeah. But these are national brands. I mean, we don't need to have this. I don't think we need to have that sort of message.
Right.
Yeah, we don't really want to tell people who they are, but
Right.
Yeah.
that's what. Yeah, so people have the people who found us have been the ones who we want to drink the beer because we're not really shouting it from the rooftops. We're not really trying to suck people in too hard. Yeah.
Well, let me ask you then a couple of questions about the craft of this, because I know that's like I can tell, very close to your heart. And actually, I thought, based on what I read about your operation, I thought you were going to talk more about that than about the design. Though
Right.
I'm very glad you talked about the design, because, of course, much of the technical aspects of brewing would be Greek to us.
That's what we feared.
A bit
So.
boring.
Yeah, but it's clearly very important to you. And so what lessons did you learn in your experience brewing that made you want to do it a little bit of a different way, or how differently is it? You mentioned ingredients, not wanting to have, I'm glad to hear, by the way, even though I hardly drink beer myself,
Right.
that the things that they put in other various products to make them seem unique, like blueberries or.
Yeah, we don't want beer to turn into ice cream or into cocktails, really. Beer is like wine or like cheese. They're very simple charcuterie, very simple ingredients. So I worked for a lot of breweries, some of them successful, a lot of them not successful, but also a lot of them that didn't seem to have beer at the core. They had running a business, being local, was really sort of the driver, and there was a disconnect between the people at the company who really loved beer and the management. And so I always saw at the beginning, if I dedicate myself to making great beer for beer drinkers, which we are, I mean, that are really adventurous, they know their stuff, then I don't have to fuss about with it has really put beer at its core. So there is a burgeoning market for this novelty beer. Right. I know maybe it'll help drag people in to have a beer that tastes like orange or something like that. But at the end of the day, the product of beer is always, it's just like with rock and roll, it's always going to come back to sort of rhythm and blues or something like that. Right. There's these ingredients, crazily different. Barley, beer was made out of barley for about 10,000 years. About 500 years ago, the second major ingredient was hops. That was introduced to the beer. And they're so different, and there's such a lot of creativity you can have with those two. With barley, there's probably 100 different varieties and roasts and things that I can use to create a beer. Yeast strains it's almost, there's a few hundred commercial strains, and there's infinite numbers of wild yeast you can bring in. There is so much, just the texture of the water, the chemistry of the water can affect the beer. So there's so much that you can do with it. And I think at the end of the day, these are the beers that win out. Because it's not only where a lot of the best beers in the world live, but it's also where the most creative, dependable, good brewers are. They're not throwing blueberries in just before the beer goes to packaging, or things like this. And so I think when people are looking for good beer, they will always have these choices that are just well thought out and put together.
So the branching into things like hats and hoodies and so forth is really just apparel for the fans. It's not necessarily an attempt to really get into other businesses.
No.
There's a demand there. People ask you for them. It's kind of a given that you do it. So we've done it. We have fun with it, don't we? But I don't know. Yeah, it was really funny because when I had never really thought about it, looked at our whole branding, and then I came to that last slide, and I was like, it's so different. It's like completely different.
Well, it does seem like the first step into some of these other, let's say, alternate, a word we don't even probably use anymore, but we were using 10 years ago all the time was alternative. Do you remember?
Yeah.
Right.
And the implication always was, I'm sorry, alternative to what?
Yes.
You really can't use that word by itself. You have to say that is an alternative to something.
Yeah.
But I find this whole genre fascinating because to circle back to the points we were talking about at the beginning, this desire to make our lives more authentic with a real product whose maker I know, with ingredients he or she stand behind in a world where we get everything delivered by Amazon.com is an increasing and probably recurring phenomenon. And maybe we'll cycle through it. Maybe it will be more linear, but I think this is here to stay.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we need to remember that the United States is a weird place in terms of alcohol, and the slate was pretty much all the breweries were wiped out about 100 years ago right now. And so when we started this, it was like garage bands. There were young punks who had no idea what they were doing, and they had a few kettles, and this whole thing came from nothing.
Right.
If you were to do research in 1975, who needs craft beer? Zero.
Right.
You would have gotten nothing.
The demand is actually zero.
This whole thing came out of nowhere, and it's a weird phenomenon, and it's created a kind of subculture of people that's all they think about is beer and beer tourism and all this other stuff. And I think it's been a positive and a growingly positive force in the U.S. I think we're the only product. Craft beer is the only product that has gone up in exports in the last 5 years. The other thing is that craft beer used to just have this thing where it would be mostly men drinking it. Now that's not the case. It's women and men. So there are couples who are going out and having a good time, both drinking the beer. And because of our weird name, we have a lot of female beer drinkers, and it's not something that we ever anticipated with. But and it's actually really nice to not always be talking to middle-aged men about beer. And when I was a brewer in England, that's all you had was middle-aged men.
Right.
Yeah, so it has a future, and it will be interesting to see where it goes. Yeah.
Well, I think you guys actually understand your audience a little bit better than you let on. Maybe you don't foreground it in the way that maybe in my questions sounds cynical, but it's as we try to find the common ground between people who do so many different things, we do bring a kind of outline that feels more or less comfortable with different folks. But I think it's one that is true about how anybody who invents, designs, creates anything has to empathize to some extent with their user or consumer or whatever. And you've as you've said very clearly, you felt like your consumer or your user had evolving and changing a bit from the first of the watercolor version of Jack Door to the much clearer trade Gothic. I don't know if that's the font, but it looked like it.
Chris Watt, I think it's called. Yeah.
But I saw. I mean, but you're right, and everybody else is noticing the same thing. So the irony is, maybe now the wall of beer will simply be a patchwork quilt of orthogonal images as opposed to a kind of vague mosaic of more colorful ones.
Totally. Yeah, who knows what we'll do next year.
Hopefully we'll stick with this. This is it.
We have a way for our students to ask questions, and they can either come straight up and ask. I think these folks here in the middle have some questions. Folks, do you guys have questions? No, I thought you were just doing something else. That's fine. I hope you're ordering some Pretty Things beer online.
It's illegal.
It's illegal in this
Don't
state.
do that.
Do we have some over Twitter? Good. We have a hashtag because we're extremely modern.
Very cool.
So would you contribute the success of beers, yours or others, more to design than the taste of the product, or where do those, at least starting off?
We talked a lot about the design today because we thought we could make a case for the design.
Sure.
It's got to be the beer. You know, there's a path to find the beer. And this is the thing we've learned since we started. But beer is what this is all about. So it's got to be about the flavor of the beer. Otherwise, I don't want to be in this business. I don't care.
I think this is a really good example of why me and Dan spend our whole lives arguing, obviously very amicably, but we do. Dan hates to even think that the design could influence whether somebody wants to drink his beer. To him, like, the beer is absolutely all there is. But inevitably, the design does play a factor. But one thing I'll say is you do see novelty beer brands where design is all they have, and it's kind of obvious. Mm-hmm. You know, they either have some scantily clad woman on the cover, or they have some silly name.
Frog giving the finger, that was a good one.
Yeah, stuff like that, or like they put hemp in it and whatever. And they just, that's like a one shot. So obviously then design doesn't
Now
work.
we didn't ask about the logo. I'm so sorry, because it's unique and it's been there since the beginning.
Totally,
no?
yeah.
So
true.
it's a tree of light bulbs on a red shield. What's the...
Yeah, we didn't really think about it, but the tree, the little white tree, is it was actually an embroidery sampler that my grandmother did when she was a little girl, and I have it framed. And on our first date, Dan walked up to it and said, "When we have our brewery, that will be our logo." And I was like, "Wow, you're counting your chickens before they've hatched." So yeah, it was always kind of decided, wasn't it? And then we just put it on the shield. But it's incredibly strong, and people love it, and I'm so glad we ended up with it.
I do too. I like it quite a lot.
Yeah.
Here we have another question in person.
Hi, good afternoon. So I heard you guys get interviewed on NPR this summer. It was kind of cool hearing that. So it's cool to put a face to the voices. But I was just wondering, what's your distribution area? Like how big you guys actually are? And then I'd actually heard that you said competition has outgrown the market, but you have gone to like the Trappist Brewery and you helped them, right? So I was wondering if you could talk about that too.
Okay. Yeah, so in terms of distribution, we're 95% of our beer is sold in Massachusetts. We do have some other fun markets that we do sell beer in. We just got back from doing a beer festival in Tuscany, and we do sell a little bit of beer there. California, we're in New Orleans. For some reason, we're in Iowa, but I think that's a relationship-based one. And at Kentucky, and but 95%. If you look at where we sell beer, if you dropped a bomb in Somerville, and it all starts there and then goes out and then gets more thinned out. That's not to say that's the way we always want it to be. We might want to sell more beer in the North Shore, South Shore, or Western Mass. We would love to, but we're right about near our capacity. And in terms of the Trappists, just before we started this business, a monk got in touch with us, and he was one of 70 monks at a Trappist monastery and sort of in the middle of Massachusetts, and they were considering opening a brewery to basically help fund their abbey. And they had a 2,000-acre abbey. They were in the jelly business, and Martha and I helped take them from, knowing nothing about beer to being able to talk about beer, being able to taste beer, understanding the beer industry, how beer is made. We took on that Trappist monk as a brewer for several years, and we got them to a certain point, and then they took it from there. And we just went and saw their brewery a week ago, and they built a massive $20-something million brewery, and just absolutely gorgeous place. And we wish them luck. They have a 100-year business plan, which is pretty impressive.
Yeah, they're kind of the opposite of us.
Yeah.
Wow. Good. Oh, sure, please.
Hi guys,
Hi.
thank you for taking time away from making beer to come talk to us.
Yay.
As
Thanks for
somebody
having
who
us.
makes my own bread and tries to always give my money to people instead of corporations, I really appreciate
Cool.
what you guys do and your message. So I'm wondering if you can talk about your design process for designing beer.
Yes.
If you've got an idea for a new flavor or a new combination of ingredients, do you test it on a smaller scale before you make a big batch of it? And how do you come up with your new ideas?
So a lot of, yeah, that's a great question. I wish we could talk another hour about that, but it is harder to talk about, unfortunately. So a lot of the beers, when we come up with ideas for beers, they're usually, well, first of all, we have them already. We have a backlog of all these things we want to do. But we usually find a nuance in a beer and think about that. You know, so a beer we like, let's say we were in Europe, we were in somewhere in West Flanders, we drink a beer and we really like it. Maybe it's a dry, bitter beer, and how do they get that particular character? So we spend a lot of time thinking about it, and then I think there's always a point where we say, oh, we're ready to go with something. And we start formulating. I bounce things off of Martha. This is like a collaboration because it's good to have someone else. If it was just me making the beer, I know exactly what all those beers would be like. And this is kind of nice that we can do this together. And by the way, while we're formulating, we're drawing the label. So we try to make the beer taste like the label look like the beer. Sort of a weird thing, but it's kind of fun for us. So I was never much of a home brewer, so my comfort is on the larger scale. So we just go for it. And I always say that we have there's always improvements you can make on a beer. So the first time that we make a go of it, we're usually like 80+% the way there. But there's always things you learn. And there's also like, you can actually work in some formulation into other beers. You can try things out sneakily in other beers that you're thinking about and just apply them and multiply them and get them into the next beer.
I think because beer is so qualitative and the enjoyment of beer is so qualitative, you can't really test it like other products. I don't think you can just throw 100 bottles out into the market and do a survey and be like, oh, well, that's the one. It's just very ephemeral, isn't it?
And fermentation's about geometry too, so you get different flavors from the geometry of the tanks you use and things, the pressure on the top and things like this. So you can't really make that beer on a small scale. You can make something that slightly resembles it. I'm better off just going for it.
Have you ever thought about doing a brew pub?
We've actually been approached a few times. There was a restaurant in Harvard that was going to open in Harvard Square that wanted to use us as the theme. We don't have the money to do that kind of thing, and we have been zero debt since the beginning,
right.
and we love it. At first it was sort of like, oh, this is kind of fun. We don't have any debt, but now it's become a way of life for us. And so, if we could ever afford it, a situation where you can be sort of in this environment that is pretty things, it would be kind of fun.
Really fun.
But we
sort
don't
of have a no nachos rule as well.
We have a no nachos.
You kind of have
yeah.
a horror of the brew pub where you,
the old brew pub.
The nachos.
Your beer is only as good as the nachos. That's the problem with.
That's an awful thought.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure you could find some other salty beer-inducing product.
Yeah.
In fact, you could design it.
That's true.
To maximize the demand for the precise flavors that your beer provides.
Yeah. No, I like it.
Well, I just think, in a way, the idea of designing an environment that has some of the same qualities. You're already doing it because you're designing the beer and the label at the same time, which sounds suspicious to me for someone who says that design plays no part in the. But I think we should just pass that over, lest we
we'll let it go.
Lest we
that's
get
totally
a rise
true.
out of that. But the idea that
we usually don't do these things with a third person on it. Whatever we say flies. So okay.
Allora.
All right.
Do we have any more from our Twitter questions?
So in terms of the I know you want the zero debt and thing, but you were talking about how your beer is kind of like an experience and how you want people to remember that. And a large part of that is, I think, for brewery tours like New Belgium and Odell in Fort Collins, they have those, and I don't know if that plays into a part that you don't have your own building or like your own brewery yourself, and how that kind of is like a give and take from that.
Yeah. Well, every weekend, my cell phone is the company phone, and every weekend it starts to buzz with people from out of town who are looking for our brewery to go on a tour, and that kills me because I would love to have something like that. But you know, that's not what we started. There are so many other places to get that, and you know, gosh, I would like to do it, but you know, I want to keep this we want to keep this a simple business. It would be very difficult for us. We do about 150 events a year, and Seth, you're probably going to do 150 plus this year, going out and meeting people. So we do outreach, and we usually have beer with us, so it's not bad. So yeah, unfortunately, we don't have that. And
but you see a trade-off, and that is, I mean, the no debt thing means, as you said early on, your empathy does not need to be for your banker. Your customer is the beer consumer, as opposed to your customer or your the first person you answer to being your banker, which I mean, I think it's meaningful to put those two things out there as trade-offs, and because, you know, this is where design thinking can help one clarify what trade-offs actually are. If you understand, empathy can apply in a debt situation. Like, you have to have empathy for your banker because he's not going to have any empathy for you. And so you have to make sure that that note gets paid, and that therefore you produce enough. Maybe I don't want to do more than 3,500 barrels, but I need to do 10,000 barrels in order to pay that note, and that changes the kind of business. So I appreciate that that's a trade-off there, maybe illuminated by this process.
We kind of lucked into it because that was the only way we could do it, and we like it, so we stuck with it.
But yeah, we know of breweries who they take out a loan, and that means they have to double that year. And when you have to double, you're not going to cut corners, but you're going to cut down on creativity. I think that's the first thing to go. Like in my experience, that's the first thing to go. You just go for the easy sell, the low-hanging fruit. We go for the high-hanging fruit.
And quite frankly, I don't think we could get enough money to do the kind of brewery. I'd like to, you know, brewery with boat rides through the middle, maybe monorail and things like this.
Monorail. Blimey.
Right. All right. Do we have any more questions? Okay. Any more questions from the audience? Yes, please.
Hi. So you talked a lot about standing out on a beer wall. So I'm wondering how you guys stand out at a bar and whether or not you've ever considered changing or altering your tap design.
That's a great question. So if you've walked into a bar, which I'm sure most of you have, the standard tap handle battle is that they just got bigger and bigger and bigger and more crazy, like flashing lights on top, just awful, the ugliest thing you've ever seen. And bartenders hate those as well because they're so heavy they just fall open and beer spills all over the floor. They're awful. So we were determined that we weren't going to play that game, but you do still see it. So we sort of made a conscious decision to go simple and pretty small and very Euro. And as you say, like, you can't tell what beer this is. Like, when you walk in, hopefully you see this and you're like, well, it's going to be a beer I'll enjoy. But it doesn't say Jack Dore on it. It doesn't say, like, this is my beer. So that is a big challenge, and it's something that we do talk about, isn't it?
But things have changed. When I first started in this business, it was all about the table tents. I haven't seen a table tent in a decade. But also, there used to be fancy printed menus where there were beers that were printed on there for many hundreds of dollars, and you know, they weren't gonna change that menu. Now you've got blackboards and you've got daily printed menus. So the tap handle is a little less important than it used to be. And also, I would say, if we had to make a new tap handle, for instance, for every beer that we made, it would limit our capabilities of being creative and to. So I think we have an add-on that can go on. We didn't bring it. I don't think we have a photograph of it, but there's
We have a little clip that you can put on the tap handle. We tried it; hasn't worked out at all.
No.
Had the beer name on it, but people don't use them, and it just doesn't really work.
You'll notice if you go around to bars, a lot of the tap handles are somebody else's tap handle with masking tape and a beer written on, and they're really beat up, and that is the beer world. I am, we make glassware that we hope that most people will serve our beer in, and that's asking a lot. Even though we're giving away the free glassware, we don't even mind if people steal them and take them home and things like that. We'll replace them. But it is asking a lot with all the things that people have to worry about in these bars and things.
Well, actually, the design of these things in general, absent the brand, is pretty genius when you think about it's like if you think of when the ergonomic design of these things, without all the screwing around of trying to turn it into an elk. Or something like this. I mean, I think there are some bars, or maybe older school bars that I remember, where there was no deviation permitted from the,
still a few of them.
And we may end up back in that kind of world one day.
There's a lot of bars now that just have simple black or marble or whatever. They don't want any branding. They say they want a clean look, and that clean look usually says there's none of our glassware and our tap handles aren't there.
It's tough.
And they use napkins instead of coasters.
Well, different people are branding different things. You're branding your beer, they're branding their bar.
Yeah. I don't mind it as long as they're pouring it into a good, clean glass. That's really nice.
It's an important point. The final, like we can make the beer, we can put it in a nice bottle, but the final step is in somebody else's hands. It's how you pour it into a glass and which glass you choose. Is it clean? Does it look nice? Does it smell good? Like everything. And it's out of our hands.
Well, it's a really good point, actually, that, when craft beer, or even just different kinds of beer, first started happening. I mean, when Guinness was a wildly different looking beer, it didn't matter that it came in a glass that was totally unadorned. You could tell what it was by its look. Then, amber colored beers, then there started to be lots of those, and then pretty soon those colors ceased to have meaning. But that's an interesting thing about beer, trying to make it so that it's branded no matter what the container is.
Yeah.
Maybe you haven't thought about that.
Yeah, I don't know.
Color. Color.
Just make the world's first pink beer.
Yeah. Well,
all right. Well, not all the ideas conceived at this table are actually excellent.
Let's put that straight out.
And maybe on that note, I should thank you both very much for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you for
Thank you.
having us.
Cheers.
Cheers.